Welcome to the audience, to each and every one of you who are attending from different parts of the world, this insider's look at the new political landscape in Washington, D.C. I'm Marie-Hélène de Koster, partner in charge of the Heidrick Struggles Brussels office and a member of the CEO and board practice with a functional expertise in government affairs. Brussels and Washington being the recognized global hubs for government affairs and public policy, this webinar is really meant to create a bridge between both our cities with the unique insider's look of our esteemed guest, Chris Lu. I will now be handing over to my colleague, Julian from our Heidrick Struggles Washington office to introduce himself and Chris.
Thank you, Marie-Hélène, and welcome everyone. I'm Julian partner with Heidrick Struggles here in DC. I have the privilege of spearheading our global public policy and government affairs practice. And I also have the great privilege of introducing my friend Chris Lu, who's kindly joining us today to help us understand the new political landscape in the U.S. Chris is eminently qualified to share his thoughts as he has been involved in public service in all three branches of the U.S. government at the highest level for over 20 years. Let me just share a few highlights of Chris's background. He is a graduate of Princeton University and Harvard Law School. His earlier career involved clerking for a U.S. Court of Appeals judge and working at a top law firm. He then embarked upon his career in the legislative branch by working for a former member of Congress and then for a former Senator Obama, as his legislative director and then as his acting chief of staff. After President Obama was elected, Chris then helped President Obama run the transition team, something we're going to talk about. It's a critical process for standing up a new government in, I think, approximately 70 days, Chris, if I'm not mistaken. And if we recall, the U.S. and the globe also faced some existential challenges in 2008 as well when Chris was leading that process. I think it's been widely acknowledged by historians that Chris ran one of the best and seamless transitions in presidential succession history. President Obama then appointed Chris as his first cabinet secretary. And then from 2014 to 2017, Chris was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate as Deputy Secretary of Labor. So for the past few years, Chris has been very busy as a senior fellow at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. He's a senior strategy advisor at a DC-based tech company called Fiscal Note, and he's a frequent commentator on major TV and cable news channels. More recently, Chris has been involved behind the scenes with the Biden transition team, which tapped Chris's experience and wisdom to help them with their transition efforts. And that is a segue into my first question for you, Chris. I think we would love to hear you share your thoughts on the presidential transition process. It's a uniquely American thing. Tell us what it entails and what was it like assisting with the presidential transition during a pandemic? What was the same? What was different compared to 12 years ago when you led that process?
Thank you, Julian, and thank you to Heidrick Struggles for having me today. It's an honor to be with all of you. You know, transitions are kind of a funny thing. On noon on January 20th, every 4 or 8 years, the top 4,000 leaders in the U.S. federal government get up and leave their jobs. For those of you from other countries, you know that this is generally not the way it works, particularly in a parliamentary system. But any of you who are in large organizations or even medium organizations know how illogical this is. In no company would you have your senior leadership all leave on one day. And the fact that we are able to pull this off in the United States every 4 or 8 years is a testament to two things. One is to the concept of a peaceful transfer of power, which we've had in this country through war and depression, even after bitterly contested presidential elections. But it's also a testament to the career civil servants, the 2 million people that protect our national security, our homeland security, ensure that health and safety and the environment, and education, and all the services that the U.S. government provides continue during this handoff of power. So, Julian, as you said, 12 years ago, we were in similar situation, but certainly not as worse as we are now. We had a financial crisis then that led to the Great Recession. But the big difference was the level of cooperation that we on the Obama team had from the outgoing George W. Bush administration. We began meeting with the Bush White House before Election Day, and we met with them side by side with the folks from the McCain campaign to work on collaboratively on what the peaceful transfer of power would look like. So we had cooperation not only before Election Day, but spanned all the way through Inauguration Day and even the day after. It's now been reported that on Inauguration Day 2009, there were credible threats on the swearing-in ceremony that required the outgoing Bush team and the incoming Obama team to closely coordinate. So let's fast forward. That was 12 years ago. Going to what we've just went through. Again, another economic crisis, but now a global pandemic. So all of the transition that we accomplished during the Biden transition was virtual. So I led the team for the Department of Labor transition, the incoming team. I had 30 people on my team who I never set foot in the same room with. I did a deep dive of about 100, that involved about 150 meetings with stakeholders, with outgoing agency officials, never met any of them in person. So that raises a whole level of complications. But then you had the difference in cooperation. For those of you that followed what we had here, the official start of the transition didn't happen until almost 3 weeks after Election Day 2020. And as Julian, you just said, there's only about 77, 78 days in a transition. So now that you've lopped off about 20 days, that's significant. Again, when you're talking about this takeover, this handover of power of the largest entity in the world. And then layer on a bunch of other complications, spotty cooperation from the outgoing administration, uncertainty about who would control the U.S. Senate. We had special elections in Georgia on January 5th. Obviously, the disruptive, tragic, violent events from January 6th were another complication, and then continue all the way to Inauguration Day, where for the first time since 1868, an outgoing president did not attend the inauguration of his successor. So I am proud that at least until this year, I had the honor of running what's considered the most successful presidential transition in modern U.S. history. But I will say that the Biden folks certainly one-upped me. The analogy I often use is if you ever watch Olympic diving and they grade diving, it's not only the execution, but it's the degree of difficulty. The Biden folks were spectacular in the execution, but they had to do it under a much more difficult circumstance. So I'm going to grade their dive a lot better than my dive.
Wonderful, Chris. Thank you very much for those great insights and this comparison. Now, with regards to the U.S. economy, what needs to jumpstart it, or what will it take for President Biden to make good on his promise to build back better?
So I think it's important to see where we are right now. We have over 1 million people, new people, applying for unemployment every week. Tomorrow, when those numbers come out, that will be the 49th actually straight week that it's higher than what we had during the Great Recession. So we are at historic levels of unemployment. We're about 10 million jobs less than where we were a year ago. We've got about 18 million people collecting unemployment insurance right now. So it's not just people out of work right now. You've got millions of people who have left the labor force, millions of jobs that are never coming back. And we can talk about what automation means, what people's spending patterns, what the restaurant, retail, business, travel industries will look like. But what all of that contributes is to poverty rates rising, food insecurity levels up, the number of people without health insurance has gone up. And so first and foremost, the economy, the U.S. economy, and frankly, the global economy doesn't fully recover, doesn't fully stabilize until we get the pandemic under control. President Biden has put out an aggressive goal of doing 100 million vaccinations in the first 100 days. And he's even now upped that and said, we're probably going to do closer to 1.5 million, 2 million vaccinations every single day. But the critical part is until that happens, so much of what is happening here in the United States economically doesn't really, get back to normal, and it's questionable at this point what normal will ever look like again. Are people really going to go back into restaurants again? Are people going to be buying in stores now that they've gotten used to buying online? Are companies, now that they're working remotely, going to put people back in expensive commercial real estate? What does that mean for commercial real estate? What does it mean for all the small businesses that rely on people physically working? What does it mean if people aren't doing business travel anymore and we're just communicating this way? So there's broader transformations with the U.S. economy. But what Build Back Better means is we don't just go back to the economy of a year ago. We actually try to address some of the systemic inequalities that we have seen, displayed over the past year. The healthcare disparities here in the United States that have meant that people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. The economic inequalities that lead to, again, whether the unemployment rate in the United States is high or low, Black unemployment is always twice the level of white unemployment, good or bad. It's always twice. And what does that mean? What does it mean, that as we've seen, during this pandemic, when you have a lack of broadband in many parts of the country? What does that mean for the ability of people to work, to create jobs, to go to school? What does it mean in terms of transportation inequalities right now when you've got mass transit in the United States operating at less than full capacity? So you've got service being cut, and what does that mean for essential workers? So the goal of Build Back Better is first and foremost to get us back to where we were last year, but then not to stop and to try to address some of these systemic problems in this country. And the real political question is whether there's that political will in Washington to do that.
Thank you. And I'd like to move on to the topic of national security and the national security team that President Biden has appointed. How do you see this will be shaping the way that the U.S. will be engaging with the rest of the world?
First of all, it's a remarkably talented and experienced group. These are people many of who I've served with in the Obama administration. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who was just confirmed yesterday as a UN Secretary, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. I could go on and on, but these are people who know the issues well. They know the players around the world. They know what has worked in the past, and they know what hasn't worked. And what's interesting is that these are some of the people who are leading these agencies. But then you look at some of the people who are working on other projects, important projects, people like former Secretary and Senator John Kerry, who has come back to lead our global climate change initiatives, or even Susan Rice, our former national security advisor, who's now the domestic policy advisor. And so while she won't be working on national security issues, she'll be working at the intersection on things like immigration policy. So it's a remarkably talented group of people. And what it reflects, I think, is, and President Biden said this, numerous times yesterday during his bilateral with Prime Minister Trudeau, which is America is back. We are going to engage with our allies. We're going to work with multilateral institutions. One of the first acts of this administration was to rejoin the Paris Climate Change Accords, was to rejoin the World Health Organization, which the previous administration had pulled out of. You saw this when President Biden addressed the Munich Security Conference the other day, and he talked about the United States commitment to Article 5, which is the mutual defense clause that NATO allies protect each other. And you'll recall 4 years ago when President Trump spoke to NATO, his commitment to Article 5 was in question. President Biden, early in his remarks, flat out said, I'm committed to this. We're going to work with our NATO allies. And you also saw this obviously yesterday in the bilateral, as I said, the bilateral meeting, the president's first bilateral meeting, period, but with Prime Minister Trudeau, where they talked about the collaboration on issues like climate change, that no longer are the United States and Canada are going to be arguing about whether climate change should be part of our conversation. And obviously, look, we're not going to agree with our allies on everything, but we're going to work through those differences in constructive ways. And I think it's important that in rebuilding these relationships and working collaboratively, the goal is to address issues like climate change, like the pandemic, like global terrorism, and also in a way that allows us to confront our adversaries, Russia, China, in a unified way. Again, we're not going to agree on every issue. Over the past 4 years, the relations with Europe have been sufficiently frayed. Europe has built its relations, obviously, with Russia and China for reasonable economic and security reasons. But it's going to mean that the United States is back asserting its leadership role again.
Chris, I'm just going to jump in. I saw a question that came in through the Q&A, and I think it's relevant to what you just shared with us, which is, given you referenced some of the different environmental approach policies that this administration is going to take, what industry sectors do you think will be most impacted by this sort of new approach, and what are some of the ramifications for some of our audience members who may be representing those sectors?
What's interesting is that while the United States at the federal level has been absent from a lot of the climate change conversations over the past 4 years, the rest of the United States has continued to move forward and tried to help meet our commitments under the Paris Accords. So you've got this remarkable initiative around state and local governments that Mayor Bloomberg has helped spearhead, but really large companies, whether it's Walmart, Amazon, are working to, make themselves more green. And more green is not only in, the buildings that they're putting up, but in trying to make their supply chains more sustainable, because companies here in the United States understand it's not just their corporate obligation, but it's good for business. And you've seen this play out in a statement that Business Roundtable put out about a year and a half ago, where they started talking for the first time that the purpose of a corporation is no longer strictly to serve the interests of their stakeholders, but to serve, their shareholders, but to serve all stakeholders, meaning their workers and the environment. So I think when you get down to your question, though, obviously the transition from fossil fuels has been happening in this country, but that's been happening for a lot of economic reasons over the last 10 years. Notwithstanding what President Trump talked about, reinvigorating coal mining in this country, there are actually fewer coal miners. There are fewer coal-fired power plants now than when he took office. So you're going to see that shift away from fossil fuels, which has already been happening. Obviously, you're going to see greater investments in renewable energy. You're going to see, obviously, you see companies like Ford and General Motors, auto companies, making the shift to electronic vehicles. But you're going to see manufacturing looking for ways to source their products in more responsible ways and looking to produce ways in ways that are more energy efficient. It's going to affect buildings. It's going to affect mass transit. And so really, climate change as a whole is an initiative that the Biden administration is not just tasking to transportation or EPA. They really are asking every federal agency to consider what they can do along the way. And that's going to be one of the central tasks. So I think it's fair to say, in a sense, it's going to affect every industry in the country, whether it's because of, potentially new government mandates or because it's frankly what customers want. I think everyone's going to have to sort of think about how they can do their work in a much more sustainable way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. I have a very interesting question coming in, which is dear to my heart, which is related to healthcare, and it's one of my majors at Heidrick Struggles as well. So this person is asking, COVID has shown the fragility of global healthcare systems, including in the USA. It also showed the strategic importance of the pharmaceutical industry and the R&D. Does the Biden administration already have a plan to adapt the healthcare system to the new reality? And will Obamacare come back on the agenda?
Yeah, so let me be clear. I can't really speak on behalf of what the Biden administration will do, but I can talk broadly about healthcare. Obviously, one of the central issues over the last 10 years since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, but really in the political debates we've had in this country over the last 4 years is healthcare. And look, as somebody who was in the Obama White House during the formulation and passage of the Affordable Care Act, I will stipulate it is not a perfect piece of legislation, but it has significantly reduced the number of uninsured people here in the United States. That figure actually has been going back up again, the number of uninsured over the past 4 years. And so one of the central issues in the Democratic presidential campaign was about whether we should do fixes to the Affordable Care Act or whether we should go for a broader Medicare for all concept, which will resemble what folks in Canada and Europe understand as more universal health care. President Biden, candidate Biden, ran on Obamacare plus some fixes, including a public option, and that is what, in the end, he believes in and what he won on. So I think in the first instance, you're going to see efforts to stabilize Obamacare, and it's not just stabilized, but we also have kind of an ongoing legal issue here in the United States. The continued legality, constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act has been called into question, and that case is sitting before the Supreme Court right now. So that needs to be addressed. There have been a lot of regulatory moves that were made by the previous administration that I think reduced the effectiveness of the Affordable Care Act. Those are being rolled back right now. You may have seen that President Biden reopened the health insurance exchanges during the pandemic, which was something that hadn't been done last year. So making sure that the system is more stable, more people have access to it, I think is critically important during this period of time. Because as your questioner said, we have seen how fragile the U.S. healthcare system has been over the last year. It's not only the number of people or the number of people who still lack health insurance, but it is we've seen the importance of not only large city hospitals, rural hospitals. We've seen the shift to telemedicine over the last year. We've obviously seen the amazing work that pharmaceutical companies have done, both with with government assistance as well as on their own initiative, have done to now get, I think, 3 vaccines or 2 certainly on the market in the United States, and the 3rd very quickly coming down the road. And I think in the end, that will be one of the great success stories of this pandemic, how quickly that was rushed out and what that means in terms of U.S. innovation, what it means in terms of future investments into research and development. And so I think, this is the issue that, again, the American people more than anything, I think, want addressed. The larger question is whether there is the political will to do that. And I think whether it's climate change, whether it's healthcare, I think that's the struggle here in the United States.
Thank you, Chris. The questions are coming in fast and furious, but we saw one that sort of takes us a little bit back to the transition process. There are some cabinet nominations that are looking like they may not get confirmed. What's the impact of that to President Biden's ability kind of to drive the agenda that he's setting? And were some of those headwinds kind of anticipated, I guess?
It is. Look, I've been in Washington. I've been in politics for over 20 years right now, and so I've seen a lot during that period of time. Every incoming administration has had at least one nomination that's run into problems. It's unfortunate the one right now that is running into problems. Neera Tanden is a friend of mine. I think she would be a fantastic budget director. But let me take it away from that. The Biden administration, while they were out of the gate quickly in terms of announcing their nominees, have now sort of fallen behind in terms of confirmations. That is not their fault. In fact, if anything, it's a lot of the uncertainty that we talked about, the lack of clarity as to which party would control the Senate. Obviously, the events of January 6th had a disruptive impact more broadly. Impeachment was an issue as well. And so at this point right now, there are fewer cabinet members confirmed than at this comparable point over the last 4 administrations. And it does have an impact because you do have political appointees in each of these agencies. But until you get a confirmed secretary in there, it's hard to make these broad changes that the president wants to make to shift policies in their direction. The analogy I often use is, federal agencies are kind of like a giant, ocean liner, a giant ship. and they're going to go in just one direction. And the only way you can really make them shift directions is that you get a lot of people that have their hands on the wheel and start to turning it. And even when a lot of people have their hands on the wheel, it is still hard to turn in a different direction. So if you want to reorient federal agencies to focus on things like climate change, like healthcare, like racial equity, you need that confirmed leadership. Now, look, our homeland security is still protected. Our national security is still protected. Money still goes out the door for education and the environment and healthcare, because that is the professionalism, the expertise of career civil servants. But those bigger kind of broader changes don't happen as quickly unless you get confirmed leadership there. So it's a problem, but this week I think they will get 4 cabinet officials confirmed, and they should get most of the cabinet done by mid to end of March, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another interesting question, and right in your sweet spot this time, Chris. Given your extensive background with the Department of Labor, the question sounds: what do you believe will be the top 3 regulatory priorities for the Department of Labor under the new administration?
Well, look, President Biden has already announced one of them, which is to do an emergency temporary standard for workplaces. And that sounds a little wonky, but let me explain what that is. It's trying to put in clear, enforceable standards for health and safety in workplaces for COVID. And it's something that wasn't done under the previous administration. And again, I think if we want employees and employers to feel safe in reopening their offices, we need to have very clear understanding about what protocols need to be in place. So the president has already announced that that is one of his priorities. I think the second big thing that's coming down the pike is how can we raise wages here in the United States? There is a ongoing debate right now as to the minimum wage and whether that a minimum wage increase should be part of this upcoming economic relief package. And it gets very wonky about how that, whether that can be included or not. But understand this, the federal minimum wage here in the United States is $7.25. That has not been raised since July of 2009. So American workers have gone 12 years without a pay raise right now. So again, that's an important issue. I think the third issue is, I think, less of a regulatory issue, but I think a longer term issue, which is, we need to start retraining our workers for the jobs of the 21st century. A lot of these retail restaurant jobs that have been lost during the pandemic are not coming back again. And that's really devastated large parts of this country. Increasingly, you cannot find a good paying job that will allow you to raise a family if you only have a high school diploma. So what do we do in terms of community colleges? What do we do in terms of apprenticeships? What do we do in terms of lifelong learning so that, people when they're in their 40s and 50s lose their jobs, we can retrain them? That needs to be part of the bill. And I think it will be part of the Build Back Better initiative that the Biden White House is pushing.
Yeah.
Chris, we have a question around trade and turning to USTR nominee Katherine Tai. Assuming she gets confirmed, are there some thoughts you can share of what you think she will drive as priorities vis-a-vis WTO with the European Union, especially with the labor angle? Love to hear your thoughts on where you think trade is headed.
Well, let me say again, one of the things that I'm fortunate is I know all of these people. I've known Katherine Tai for a long time. She's going to be a remarkable U.S. trade representative. For those of you that don't know, she was the lead trade counsel for the House Ways and Means Committee. She was integral in the final negotiations around the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And what's remarkable is she was able to get that agreement in such a place that organized labor unions here in the United States were supportive of that agreement. And so when you can get a pro-free trade person with somebody who is pro-worker rights, that's a great combination. It's one of the reasons why her nomination has been so widely applauded. I don't have a sense of what it means in terms of WTO, but I will say more broadly on trade, the politics of trade have become significantly more complicated than they were 10 or 15 years here in the United States. And it doesn't necessarily break down on partisan lines. There is a strong, obviously populist nativist sense in the United States. I mean, let's be honest, it was always hard to get free trade agreements done. When President Clinton signed NAFTA back in 93, I guess, he was able to pull together a coalition of sort of more moderate Democrats with Republicans who were willing to, to do this, because trade has never been a wildly popular thing here in the United States, even if I can give you all the statistics about how exports are good for the U.S. economy. I think that kind of coalition of people in the center who are willing to, jump together on trade has gotten smaller and smaller. And, I think I still have the scars of my final year at the Obama administration, where I was sent out to sell the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when you're the Deputy Secretary of Labor and you're talking to unions about TPP, that doesn't make you a very popular person. USMCA was an important renegotiation of NAFTA, but in many ways did not significantly change the foundations of it. But I think moving forward, getting free trade agreements done, whether it's on a bilateral basis, on a multilateral basis, are going to be harder and harder. And the unfortunate part about this is the rest of the world isn't waiting for the United States to figure this out. They're already entering into agreements. So I think even in a Democratic administration, this is going to be very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Going back to one of the former presidents, Reagan's favorite lines, that was the 9 most terrifying words in English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And as Julian stated earlier in your introduction, you spent most of your career in public office and in all 3 branches, judicial, executive, and legislative. Do you have a rebuttal to submit to the audience on this?
I'm a big believer in government, and I will freely stipulate that government isn't perfect. But all of our lives are improved by the work that government does. Again, whether it's protecting our security, helping to educate our kids, making sure that the air and water we breathe is cleaner, helping us find jobs. And so I think we should all want government to succeed. And I always tell people, look, if you don't like government, I can literally, explain when you walk from your house or, go from your house to your office back in the pre-pandemic days, 15, 20 different ways that government is going to either help you or regulate something that you've done on the way to the office or when you're in the office. And I suspect those of you in the EU can probably come up with 50 ways that the EU has or that government has affected your life. I will say that in my view, government isn't broken, but I think our politics are broken. As somebody who, as the Deputy Secretary of Labor, I was the COO of a $12 billion federal department. And I saw the way that the dedicated way that our employees worked and the challenges they had. And I mean, I'll give you one example. Our headquarters building in the Department of Labor had no Wi-Fi. We not only did not give laptops to most of our employees, they didn't even have mobile devices that were issued by the government. We still had these giant mainframe computer rooms. It was almost like 1990s technology in the 2010s. And part of that is the way that government is funded. We are funded by 1-year appropriations. Now, if any of you are in large companies, you know that when you're going to make investments in things like IT, you don't do it in 1-year chunks. You just do the whole thing at one time, and you consider that an investment. And unfortunately, our politics have ensured that government doesn't always have the resources they need to do their jobs. I'd say the other problem that we have in the United States is that our politics are broken, and often we are not called upon in government to really kind of address the great challenges until we're in a crisis period of time. The perfect example right now is infrastructure. Our infrastructure is broken here in the United States. And on a bipartisan basis, we know that we need to put more money into roads and bridges and airports and invest in broadband. We saw what happened in Texas last week with the power grid. we know we need to make these investments. We know it's going to cost money, but we know that if you don't do it, it's going to cause more problems down the road. And yet we can't seem to figure out a way to do that. And so we kind of, in the United States, lurch from crisis to crisis with piecemeal solutions to problems, never sort of fully addressing things. And so government agencies end up, I think they're just the manifestation of a broken political system. So when they're called in to address issues, it's often at the last minute with insufficient resources, without a sufficient mandate to fix it. So we come up with lots of Band-Aid solutions to problems. So it's really not government, I would say, that's broken, but our political system.
Well, on that note, Chris, I mean, another area where I think folks can agree or disagree where government can play a role is education. And we've had a number of questions come in where it's been highlighted that certainly the primary and secondary sectors of our education system here in the U.S. are not functionally, optimally, and especially for lower socioeconomic folks. And the disruption from the pandemic certainly adds and compounds to that gap. Do you have any perspective you can share on perhaps the Secretary of Education nominee, Miguel Cardona, and maybe what the Biden administration is going to do in terms of U.S. education?
Yeah, I mean, Miguel Cardona is an interesting choice as somebody who comes from state and local education. And it's important for folks to understand who are not Americans that in the United States, our education system is functionally controlled by state and local officials. Yes, there is a federal Department of Education that sets broader standards, that provides funding largely for underprivileged students or makes investments into higher education. But when you're talking about K-12 education, that's largely the domain of state and local leaders. And so to have somebody like Miguel Cardona come in, I think provides an important perspective, as did the Obama Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, the first one, who ran the Chicago public school system. I mean, if you want to fix K-12, you need people who have been on the front lines. But again, as we have seen during this pandemic, we have educational disparities in this country that are largely based on geography, that are largely based on race. And so when you've got schools that are closing, and you've got kids who are now trying to learn from home in places that either they don't have broadband or the home doesn't have access to broadband, that creates challenges. And then add another level of challenges that for far too many students in this country, they rely on subsidized government meals at schools. Either it's school lunches, it's school breakfast. And when those schools are closed, how do you provide for the nutritional needs of the students, which we know contributes to their academic success. And so much of this is, based on geography, and it's one of the reasons why, we really need to address housing resegregation in this country, because where you grow up has a powerful impact in terms of your upbringing, in terms of your schooling, in terms of the environment, into your ability to succeed. So I will simply say this. I mean, technology is one part of it. And it's one of the reasons, again, going back to infrastructure, there needs to be broader investments in broadband, because even if we're not in a pandemic, the ability of kids to learn in the 21st century can't be simply based on, the way that all of us learn, sitting there with a teacher and a blackboard and books. It's going to rely on computers, and it's going to rely on technology, not only at school, but at home. So I think important investments in technology. There is obviously a longstanding debates in this country about standardized testing, about core curriculum, core standards. And I'm not going to get into any of that, but I do think having a Secretary of Education who has come out of these, the local areas, and who has been part of these debates, I think will be incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. I just want to, this is a great segue as well to one of the questions that we've received, which, we've been reading about, I think, on both parts of the ocean, is about the tech industry. We just mentioned it about technology, but the tech industry, has navigated evolving landscapes in DC and in Brussels. Big tech had favorable access and influence in DC during the Obama years, but that obviously changed under Trump. And the European attitude towards US tech companies, which were never really, really that great, have deteriorated. What are your thoughts around, it's a huge topic, but what are your initial thoughts about this?
Yeah, I would say that U.S. attitudes, I would say European attitudes towards big tech companies may be matched by U.S. attitudes towards big tech company. I mean, it is one of the issues that you are starting to find, certainly in Congress, strange bedfellows between conservatives and liberals about the need for greater regulation of tech companies. Now, for completely different reasons. I mean, obviously, there's been a broader debate among conservatives that tech has become too big, that they are stifling the voices of conservatives. Progressives have a different series of concerns, but some of them relate to misinformation, obviously privacy concerns, the broader treatment of workers by tech companies, I think is. So I think, you are going to have, there is going to be strong bipartisan sentiment to regulate tech industries. Obviously, there's a broad debate right now about Section 230 and whether that provision still continue to apply. I would say this, though. I mean, again, I'm not in government, and so I don't have the insights of what people are thinking. What has been remarkable, is the innovations of the tech industry. And what I often worry about, and I say this as, a pretty strong Democrat who believes in government regulation, is that government regulation often operates is often really heavy-handed, and I think has the potential to stifle innovation. And so I'm all for figuring out ways to curb abuses. But if we can do that without stifling the innovations and the positive impacts that come out of this, I think that makes sense. But, far too often it's hard to find that balance between sensible regulation and innovation. And so in the end, I think what you're going to see, again, based on the fact that I think here in Washington, gridlock makes it hard to get anything, you're going to continue to see greater state efforts around state regulatory efforts, not only around privacy, but around other issues, which I think is going to be complicated, certainly when you're talking about tech companies whose reach expands around the world.
So in keeping in line with the tech theme, and this will probably be our last question because we promised to only take up 45 minutes of your time and the audience's time, and we know how super busy you are. But in terms of tech, you are one of the senior advisors to a very cutting edge technology company out there called Fiscal Note. Can you tell us a little bit about Fiscal Note and how maybe it and other disruptive technologies and platforms are enhancing the ability to analyze and utilize information, big data, machine learning, and that implication for both government affairs practitioners, but also just making government be better, right, in terms of the impacts and the ripple effects?
Thank you, Julian, for giving me the chance to shamelessly plug. Fiscal Note is a 8-year-old technology, data, news, and artificial intelligence company. We basically serve about 5,000 large clients, everything from Fortune 50 companies down to nonprofits, government agencies, and help them use data and news to better understand the policy landscape and help shape it. That was a lot of words. Let me tell you what that functionally means. As somebody who spent more than 20 years in government, I sort of think about how most government affairs professionals do their work. It is based on, I know X person. I literally still have a paper Rolodex, and I'm going to flip my Rolodex, and I'm going to call X person because he or she can help me fix a problem. Or I'm going to read something, or I'm going to hand a piece of paper to somebody making my point. And when my policy issues, my regulatory issues expand beyond one legislative body into states, other countries, I hire more people like myself to help me solve problems. And you think about what an inefficient way that is to try to, if you're a multinational organization, continue to hire people to talk to other people is in no way how any other industry does its work. I started my career at a law firm, and there were like big legal libraries and there were big document rooms and we would do discovery and we'd look through pieces of paper. You go to any law firm now, that's not the way it works. They use technology to transform how they do their work. And yet when we talk about government policy, government affairs, regulatory issues, people kind of still do their work now the way they did it 50 years ago. And so what Fiscal Note is really trying to do is to take technology and help transform people and make them more efficient and make them more effective in their work. And so it's been a wonderful affiliation. It's great to be part of it. We have an award-winning newsroom and Roll Call newspaper, which is one of the iconic newspapers in Washington covering Congress. And so I think it's just one example of the ways that technology is transforming how people do their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Chris, I think on behalf of Heidrick & Struggles and Marie-Hélène and the DC office and the Brussels office, we can't thank you enough for sharing your proprietary insights with us today. It was really informative. Thank you so much. And we thank the audience and we wish everyone well and a good rest of their days.